Hero System is one of those games that whenever I revisit it, I always find something new to love about it. Usually because I discover something I didn't have explained to me when I first learned Hero. And what I find usually answers some questions that I've long had. Today, the discovery we'll be discussing and having a dialogue about is naked power advantages. As I described earlier, powers in Hero are made of three parts: their main effect, advantages that make them more effective but more costly, and limitations that make them weaker but cheaper. Naked power advantages are a way to apply an advantage to any power that meets certain criteria without needing to build it into another power. Such as if you want to be able to add armor piercing to any energy blast power to reflect that your character has a knack for always targeting weak points when using ranged attacks. Let's start with the rules for using them. There are two methods of using naked power advantages: the group method and the single method. The group method represents a special ability that can be applied in many situations. The book gives the example of a character that can use Auto Fire 3 with any gun. This method could also represent a character's ability to attack anybody in a given area provided they have a big enough weapon by applying Area of Effect in a similar way. The single method, by contrast, represents how a character can learn new ways to use one distinct power. I like to think that this is a good representation of shonen anime nonsense. A good example of this being how Yusuke Urameshi in Yu Yu Hakusho ends up having several different ways to use his spirit gun as the show goes on. Both of them have different ways of calculating their cost, so you can't necessarily use one in place for the other. It's either a way to use a group of powers in one special way, or multiple ways to make a given power have more functions. Let's start with the group method. The steps for this are: decide the maximum active cost that this naked power advantage can apply to, calculate the active cost of a power as if it had that naked power advantage, and then subtract the original active cost from the new active cost. Step 3 leaves us with the active cost of the naked power advantage. At this point, if you want to add more advantages and limitations to the naked power advantage, they apply to the cost generated from step 3. There's a few extra caveats for this method. For one, it can only use up to the active cost that it was built for. If you happen to have access to a power with a higher active cost than the NPA was built for, you simply use the NPA's active cost and assume it's because the character hasn't quite figured out how to use it that effectively yet. Interestingly, this is based on the active cost of the power it's being used with, which means any advantages already applied to the power also take effect when the NPA is added. The book's example is an auto-fire ability on firearms that go up to 60 active points. It then states that this will work for a 4d6 ranged killing attack, a 2.5d6 with armor piercing, or even a 2d6 explosion. All of these are below 60 active points, and would be able to strike up to 3 times. Let's move on to the single method. The steps are: first, you calculate the cost of the power as if it had the NPA, include any limitations. Then you subtract the original cost from the new cost. This is the NPA's base cost. All the original limitations and advantages apply to this NPA as well, though it may have its own advantages and limitations, starting with the cost from step 2. The example given in the book is a wizard who has a fairly generic attack spell, but wants to have another spell that can be woven into that one to make it at once stronger, but still very generic. It's much cheaper than if you went with a group NPA method, but only because calculating the cost also requires the focus and incantation limitations that the original spell does. In either case, naked power advantages cost endurance, and that cost is 1 endurance for every 10 active points. Regardless of which method you use, there's 3 things to keep in mind about naked power advantages. You need to verbally describe in plain language what it represents. It has an active cost, and it is a power. For the first point, Stating what any ability or other decision means is generally a good idea in games where you're given a lot of freedom for building characters. It narrows down the decisions you need to make when picking out effects. The Naked Power Advantages section reiterates a few times that common and dramatic sense should be used when considering how naked power advantages work in-game. This is why so often in games with a lot of freedom for character creation, they say to have a concept for your character before you start picking out abilities. In the case of Hero, it allows you to figure out how to handle ambiguities. For example, if you have a character that can auto-fire with any weapon up to 3 times, they should only be able to use 2 shots with a double-barrel shotgun. Unless they're Mo Sizlak, of course.
Just give him one of these. Ooh, hey, ooh.
To the second point, since it has an active cost, this also means you can add advantages and limitations to it. Costs no endurance being the most reasonable option for advantages, and limitations can represent that there's extra effort needed to do this exceptional feat, such as increased endurance. Going along with the theme of use common sense, it's possible that an NPA can be built with extra time while the powered effects may not have this. An obvious take on this is that a more complicated or more powerful attack may take some extra time to prepare, and thus, using the NPA to simulate that, the entire power goes off when the NPA says so, even though the power without the NPA might normally be instant. This is also consistent with the rules for holding actions, which I won't go into too much detail on. The short version, as I understand it, is that attacking is a half-phase action, using a power as a zero-phase action. You can hold actions until a specific time, and then use them. So, using the NPA is preparing the more powerful attack as a zero phase, and then launching it at a later time can be the half phase that you held. To the third point, it is a power. The rules state that you can use any number of powers at once, so long as you pay any requisite costs for it, such as endurance or charges. This further means that Drain, Dispel, and Suppress can actually be much more effective when someone is using NPAs. When I was initially taught Hero, I was told that naked power advantages, as well as Drain, Suppress, and Dispel, weren't really worth using. They took too much effort to be made effective and you wouldn't be able to do anything else. Imagine my surprise when I came back to this decades later and realized that those folks were, well, not the brightest gaming group, but my personal woes are not the reason for this video. NPAs are a cheap way to get more functionality out of a small handful of powers without writing a new power entirely and having to pay that full cost. Combined with them being the powers unto themselves, this makes them susceptible to adjustment powers that reduce effectiveness, balancing the extra power NPAs give against the weakness of adjustment powers that my previous group described. And this gives interesting narrative effects. Consider a suppression field that can negate magical powers. It may not be strong enough to completely nullify a character's magic, but it can force them to use a weakened version of their spells if it can negate all of their NPAs. A 66 suppression field is very unlikely to negate somebody's 66 energy blast, but it could easily negate their 15-point NPA that grants that energy blast armor piercing. As an added note, though, adjustment powers need the variable effect advantage to affect broader classes of powers, as well as multiple powers at once. The weakest of these being any broad scope of 1 at a time, followed by 2 at a time, 4 at a time, or any number. Let's look at some examples I cooked up myself. The group method can be useful in heroic games, representing a warrior that knows how to effectively wield certain weapons in unusual ways. We can say this is knowing how to effectively strike everybody too close as long as they have a big weapon. We'll stat out this NPA as follows. It's a wide swing with melee weapons that have up to 60 active points. It's a 3-hex area of effect on either side of a front-facing target. This gives us 60 points, 2 points of advantages, for a total of 120. We subtract the 60 that would apply to, and it would thus cost 60 points to have this. We base this power on up to 60 active points, since most weapons listed in the equipment section have an active cost of 50 points or so. This gives us some room for having a magical sort of weapon that's actually far greater than a standard weapon, should we want that. Worth noting is that this has a particularly high point cost, making it difficult to use in a heroic game. This is made more challenging since the 60 active cost would mean that they have to spend 6 endurance for the area of effect on top of however much they're using for that weapon. With this in mind though, we can make this the centerpiece of the character. They're a warrior that can strike down 7 men in one strike, and we can give them strength, constitution, and body to match that physique. And it can be rounded out with a few combat skill levels as well, since combined with most of the basic maneuvers all characters have access to, combat skill levels give characters a variable pool of points that they can add to OCV or DCV as needed. Meanwhile, as I stated earlier, the single method is useful for shonen anime nonsense. We'll start with a basic energy blast that we'll call the Hot-Blooded Blast, and keep it relatively simple at first. The advantages we give it will be add-ons for it that our character develops as they go on adventures. Since this is a shonen anime, we can justify a few things like gestures and incantations, as well as extra time. They need their hands free to shout the name of the attack and to spend some time charging it up. In other words, their special attack is telegraphed. Here's our stat block for it. We start with an 8d6 energy blast with a base cost of 40. We give it no advantages, so it has an active cost of 40 as well. We then tack on the gestures, incantations, and extra time, one segment, for the real cost of 20. With that, we can then write up a few special variations of it, such as one that does extra knockback so the environment can be used as a weapon. We'll call this the Forceful Hot-Blooded Blast. So the active cost of the Hot-Blooded Blast with the advantage double knockback would make it 70 points. The real cost of it would be 35, thus our NPA cost would be 15 active points. We can also make a shotgun variation that has a much shorter range but hits a wide area in front of them. We call this the Hot-Blooded Shotgun. We give it the AoE cone, but give it no range so it goes off directly in front of our hero. The active cost with this advantage is 80, and the real cost with it is 40. Thus the cost of the NPA would be 20 active, 13 real. And last, we can also have an energy bomb version of it that can be lobbed over obstacles and used to blast a small area from far away. We call this the Hot-Blooded Mortar. It's an area of effect that targets a single hex and has the indirect advantage. This, like our shotgun, gives us an active cost of 80, a real cost of 40, and the NPA is thus 20. If this were a particularly high point value game, we could actually take all of these at once if we so wanted. But if we use this as a setup in a longer running game, the cost of most of these naked power advantages could be acquired in about 7 sessions, assuming we get 3 experience per session. Everything that I've said up to this point has been about how the rules for naked power advantages appear in 5th Revised Edition, so I'm going to take some time to go over the differences in other editions, specifically 6th Edition and Sidekick. To the point of Sidekick, naked power advantages simply aren't included. They're an edge case to the core rules of an already dense game. There is no need to include something that makes things yet more complicated in what is meant to be a concise, rules-light version of a complex game. 6th Edition, by contrast, has all the same text as 5th Edition, with a few important additions. It clarifies what happens when you use multiple naked power advantages at once in that section. The short version being that applying a naked power advantage raises the active cost of the power being used, at least temporarily. Thus, using multiple naked power advantages would require at least some of them to affect a much higher active cost in order for them to all stack together, per the 6th Edition rules. Another important note in 6e is that naked power advantages function like a flat cost power, meaning that adjustment powers such as drain and suppress need to affect the entire active cost of the power. In 5th edition revised, none of these details are included in the naked power advantages section. However, there are blurbs in other sections that can lead somebody to that conclusion. So, while these are arguable cases in 5e, it's much more explicitly stated in 6e, and they are all consistent with the internal logic of Hero System. The rulebook mentions that naked power advantages are a distinct power called special powers. In context, it was explaining that you can't put them in a power framework because they are special powers. I didn't get that at the time, but I made a note of that factoid. Then, to confirm my thoughts on Drain, Dispel, and Suppression, I looked up how Hero classifies different powers. Special was in fact one of the classifications, and it was meant as a catch-all for all the really weird edge cases, like naked power advantages. I bring this up because this is a fine example of research and reading for comprehension. When you're reading for comprehension, you're going to do a lot of reading. You're going to skip around a lot. You're going to reread the same passages several times, probably because reading it once was not enough. Research is laborious. When you encounter a part of the text that confuses you, make a note of that and look for additional context later. For something long like Hero, this usually means reading some other part of the text where that thing is mentioned and is thus why the best rulebooks have a decent index. If it's shorter, you'll need to read some other similar works or what other people have said about the work in order to make sense of it. The game Roll for Shoes is a good example of this, since the rules and character sheet for it can fit across both sides of a business card, but it hinges on knowing something about tabletop RPGs to work. All of this also reminds me of my favorite edition of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Not only was the original text translated, but so was commentary of those passages by various generals and scholars who have read it before this translation was made. And when I was reading a line by Sun Tzu that didn't make sense, reading some of the commentary gave it that little bit of extra context that helped me get it. There is no disgrace in having to reread a book, nor is there any disgrace in having somebody else explain it to you. Just be sure that you never rely on one source of information alone when you're doing research. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting or helpful, give me one of those thumbs up likes that I love so very much. And if you want to know more about Hero System, check out some of my other videos, or consider subscribing. With all that said, I am Aaron Der Schädel, and I will see you all next time.